Reconciliation means working together to correct the legacy of past injustice. The words of Nelson Mandela, the South African former president, passed away peacefully at his Johannesburg home Thursday at the age of 95. Just like the whole world, here at Levant TV, we reflect today on this leader's long battle to free South Africa from apartheid. We're also going to be joined by Middle Eastern news analyst Hassan Al-Khatib, who will be discussing the Syrian conflict with us. But first, let's start with papers here in the UK. Papers across the UK have paid tribute to Africa's most famous son, Nelson Mandela, a day after his death. The Guardian calls him the towering figure of Africa's struggle for freedom, as it takes a look at tributes from notable figures. The Independent refers to Mandela as a model of faith, hope and charity. There was about him something to which the world aspired. It was as if we saw ourselves dimly reflected in his glory. The Daily Telegraph charts Mr. Mandela's life as the architect of South Africa's transformation from racial despotism to liberal democracy in a 7-part obituary. Now let's take a look at the top stories in the Middle East. As Syria's crisis deepens and foreign fighter numbers in Syria increase dramatically, let's take a look at the very opinionated arguments from today's analysts. Syria Times has an opinion piece which takes a look at the rising numbers of foreign fighters in its article "Threats of the Increase of Foreign Fighters in Syria," as a note obtained from EU counter-terrorism coordinator Gilles de Kerchove stresses that numbers of fighters travelling back and forth from the country is increasing. The paper says the note obtained by the Associated Press specifically calls for better use of airline passenger information available to security officials to keep track of when and how terrorists move to Syria. The note does not name the number of fighters travelling from the 28-member EU states to Syria. However, it notes that the 11 Western European countries with the biggest contingents in Syria are estimated to have some 1,200 to 1,700 people among terrorists, according to government and analyst figures. That compares to estimates of 600 to 800 from those countries in late spring. The paper says that the head of Britain's domestic spying agency said the intelligence service had seen low hundreds of people from Britain go to Syria and that some have since returned, stoking fears extremists could pose a domestic threat. It adds that EU Interior Minister will also be looking at ways to cooperate more closely with Syria's neighbour Turkey, through which most of the fighters move to get to the Syrian rebel camps. It concludes that the EU-based terrorists are drawn by recruiters arranging travel and comfortable lodgings. They instill militant Islam that EU security officials see as a potent threat once the fighters return home. Writing for Russia's Pravda, Nikola Nasser takes a look at who he believes is responsible for the current situation in Syria in his article, "Insurgency Responsible for Civilian Plight of Syrians." Nasser believes creating a humanitarian crisis in Syria, whether real or fabricated, and holding the Syrian government responsible for it as a casus belli for foreign military intervention under the UN 2005 so-called Responsibility to Protect initiative was from the very eruption of the Syrian conflict the goal of the US-led Friends of Syria coalition. He highlights that objective and non-objective, as well as official and non-official reports about the responsibility of the Syrian government are abundant, but that of the insurgents has been for too long covered up and only of late come under the scrutiny of human rights organisations and media spotlight. Nasser adds that unguardedly and grudgingly, but knowingly, the so-called Friends of Syria also opened the Syrian doors to al-Qaeda-linked offshoots as an additional weight to enforce a regime change. In no time, they hijacked the armed leadership of the marginal local armed insurgency. According to Nasser, the responsibility of the Friends of Syria, both Arab and non-Arab, for the militarization and the ensuing humanitarian crisis was highlighted by the US former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's call on Syrian rebels not to disarm, as much by the Turkish, Saudi and Qatari opposition to a political solution through the upcoming Geneva II conference next January 22nd. Nasser says the responsibility of the insurgency, which is politically sponsored, financed, armed and logistically facilitated by Friends of Syria, is now unfolding to uncover the fact that the militarization of the early legitimate peaceful protests has created the largest humanitarian crisis in the world today by the military tactics the insurgents used. These tactics include mortar shelling of civilian, densely populated areas under government control. He adds that the fact that the Syrian state and government were reacting rather than acting against the insurgency is now coming to light. This fact is explained better by the UK-based opposition Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which reported on this December 3rd that it had documented the death of 50,927 government soldiers versus 36,228 insurgents, including 6,261 non-Syrian fighters. Nasser also points out that in addition to Christians and other minorities targeted by the rebels, who posture as the defenders of Islam, Sunni Islam, most of the refugees and those displaced are Sunni Muslim Syrians, and more than 1 million of them are hosted by their compatriot Alawites in the west of the country, a fact that refutes the narrative of the US government and media about a civil and sectarian war in the country. Reporting for the Wall Street Journal, Siobhan Gorman in Washington, Cassel Bryan-Lowe in London and Maria Abi Habib in Beirut write an article headlined, "Jihadists returning home to Europe from Syria pose new terror threat," in which the authors claim that a series of arrests have heightened fears and the problem is expected to grow as the conflict drags on. According to the writers, scores of jihadist fighters from Europe who streamed to Syria to join Islamic extremist rebels have begun returning home, where some are suspected of plotting terror attacks, according to US and European intelligence and security officials. The writers state that authorities in the UK and France recently made several terror-related arrests of individuals suspected of links to Syria. The writers refer to a senior US intelligence official who said they're real committed jihadists. The concern is that we're at the very early stages of this. The writers view that for the US and Western countries, the returning jihadists pose the biggest long-term concern of the Syrian civil war, the official said. Governments are rushing to counter the new terror threat. The writers believe that once in Syria, many are believed to fight alongside al-Qaeda-affiliated groups such as Jabhat al-Nusra or the Nusra Front and the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, known as ISIS. The writers point out that, recruited through a network of mosques across Europe, these jihadists then make the pilgrimage to safe houses in southern Turkey, where they prepare to cross the border into Syria's battlefields. The writers indicate that European governments are most concerned about ISIS fighters returning because that group wants to use Syria as an al-Qaeda operations headquarters for global terror. At ISIS and Nusra Front safe houses across southern Turkey, fresh recruits from Europe, Australia and to a lesser extent the US turn in their Western passports and receive a Syrian ID. They are issued a nom de guerre and cross the border to Syria's battlefields. According to European diplomats, the procedure for Jabhat and ISIS is to hold the passports centrally. Those passports can be reused and they can now go anywhere in Europe. The writers claim that European and other governments often can do little to prevent someone from travelling to Syria. But in April, the UK announced new rules making it easier for British authorities to confiscate the passports of Britons suspected of travelling to training camps or other terrorist-related activity. The writers go on to say that authorities in the Netherlands recently clarified laws designed to prosecute individuals travelling to or returning from jihadist conflict zones, and in October secured their first conviction under the newly amended law. To conclude, the writers state that France last year also introduced a law to allow authorities to prosecute people planning terror attacks abroad and those suspected of allegedly terrorist activity overseas. We're joined today by Hassan Al-Khatib, news correspondent expert on Middle Eastern affairs, who will be discussing the internal and external impact jihadists are having on Europe as a result of the Syria conflict. Hello Hassan, thank you for joining us today. What do you think of the concerns raised in the West pertaining to terrorist threats posed by jihadists fighting in Syria?
Well, they have a lot to be concerned about, but if we remember at the very beginning of this conflict, nearly 3 years ago, the West actually ignored such threats and concerns and allowed foreign militants from Western countries to go into Syria and fight over there. They saw them as a tool to push their agenda to try and topple the Assad government. And they were hand in hand in supporting them and financing them, although inadvertently through the rebel fighters in Syria. But then afterwards, as we can see right now in the political field at the moment, we see the Assad government are winning at the moment, and we see the rebel fighters and also the foreign militants in that country who are losing and who are packing their bags and are trying to go back to their own countries. And that's now where the Western foreign policy started to change. Now they know that Assad can't be defeated, and now what do they do with these foreign militants who came from the West, fighting in Syria, and now wanting to come back? So this dilemma, which they have allowed to happen, and now they have to try and address, because they were hoping they would go there and be successful in toppling the government and destroying the country on the other hand as well. So, well, of course, these are the concerns, these are the issues at the moment, and they've allowed that to happen because of their own agenda.
So you don't think that these concerns are being over-exaggerated?
In a way, I think they have been slightly over-exaggerated, because obviously most of these fighters in the West who go over to fight in Syria, the chances of them fighting or attacking targets or places inside the West are very minimal. And it's because of the atmosphere that the West has created in, if you like, supporting and fighters in Syria, which they wouldn't do inside their own countries. So I don't think a large percentage of those who are coming back from Syria are actually going to attack the West. Obviously, some may do, so there is obviously a threat which is real, but maybe not to such an extent whereby they think it's going to be on a mass level, and these fighters are going to be targeting the West as much as they are or have been doing in Syria.
And do you think anyone in particular is responsible for the increase in foreign fighters in Syria?
Well, over the years, there's been many players involved in this, obviously Saudi and Qatar, and even countries like America and Britain who have supplied weapons and money, although very secretly, of course, to these rebel fighters. And as we know, a lot of these groups, the rebel groups in Syria, have a large proportion of militant fighters from abroad and also from Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, etc. So they've pretty much been quite, very present in these. And even Israel has been giving strategic, helping the fighters, rebel fighters, to go there and fight, and they've been treating them and then sending them back into the arena to fight. So there's a lot of players who have allowed these foreign fighters, who have given them the oxygen of fighting there and of having weapons and of having the material and the training to be fighting over there. But obviously the finger can't be pointed at one particular group, but it's mainly the Western countries backed by Saudi Arabia and Qatar.
Thank you for your time, Hassan, and for your opinions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now let's take a look at what analysts are saying about the nuclear deal that has been made between Iran and the P5+1. The Eurasia Review features an analysis by Riyad Kahwaji titled "Middle East, Nuclear Talks Could Be Undermined by Some US Regional Allies." The author writes that the deal has caused some controversy in the Middle East since the perception there is that Iran is the big winner in this deal and Washington influence in the region is on the retreat. Tehran's complex and powerful PR machine is doing everything possible to assert this belief. Washington is unable to convince the Arab world that there is no rapprochement with Iran and that the agreement will actually prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear threshold state. Meanwhile, Israel and the US are in disagreement over the new deal. Both the Obama administration and the Israel lobby have been locked in a bitter showdown in the media and on the Hill over Washington's new policy towards Iran. The author writes that Iran is now also trying to create a rift between Saudi Arabia and other Gulf allies of the West on the basis that Riyadh, through its funding and aiding of rebels in Syria, is supporting anti-Western jihadist groups which are spreading death and terror throughout the Middle East, especially Syria. The author adds that the Iranian foreign minister excluded Saudi Arabia from his recent regional diplomatic visit. Furthermore, Iranian ally Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah's Secretary General, openly accused Saudi Arabia of orchestrating the bomb attack on the Iranian embassy in Beirut last month. He adds that Saudi Arabia is entering more negotiations with Russia and China as a message to Washington, and that the ethno-sectarian conflict sweeping the region now, with Saudi Arabia and Iran positioned on the opposite ends of the divide, is much more serious than Washington thinks. Kahwaji concludes that strategically, Riyadh must feel respected and involved in any permanent agreement reached with Iran. This inclusion will have an immediate positive impact on the conflicts in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq and Afghanistan. Such a move will mute the Sunni-Shiite struggle, which will benefit Iran. Mohammed Shataya writes an article for Haaretz titled "Geneva, Iran, Geneva, Syria, Why Not a Geneva Conference for Palestine?", saying that a nuclear power like Israel is content with current negotiations. Shataya adds, employing empty rhetoric and diversionary tactics, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu offers negotiations without parameters and draws attention to Iran, while his cabinet is split between those promoting the extension of settlements in Palestine and those who reject the release of Palestinian prisoners. Shataya says that his decision to resign as Minister of the Palestinian Economic Council for Development and Reconstruction would not have been necessary in the presence of a serious Israeli partner, one that was ready and able to make the decisions needed to prepare Israelis for a final status agreement with Palestine. He adds the success of the Geneva talks over the Iran issue and the possibility of success for the Syrian issue makes us wonder why there is no talk about a Geneva-Palestine discussion. He adds that we would exchange the current bilateral situation for a multilateral forum where other powers can contribute to a just and lasting peace for Israel, Palestine and the rest of the region. Shataya concludes that if the multilateral framework of the Geneva talks worked elsewhere, why not for Palestine? Laura Rosen writes for Al Monitor an article headlined P5+1 turns focus to implementing Iran nuclear deal. According to Rosen, Western diplomats expressed confidence about Iran sticking to the terms of an interim nuclear accord signed in Geneva last month as they met to discuss implementing the agreement and the process going forward for negotiating an end-state deal. Rosen refers to Under-Secretary of State Wendy Sherman, who said, "I think it will hold because it's in Iran's interest for it to hold. Iran is looking for some economic relief. There's very little in this agreement, but it is the first step to a comprehensive agreement which will give them the economic relief they're looking for." Rosen sees that Deputy Secretary of State William Burns has been leading a bilateral channel with Iran that gained momentum after the August inauguration of Iranian President Hassan Rouhani. Wendy Sherman claims all of the issues that arose in that private bilateral conversation also arose in the P5+1, and I think very effectively the P5+1 used our bilateral channel and other bilateral discussions that were going on with other partners to get to this agreement. Rosen states the parties agreed to try to reach a comprehensive deal during the 6-month phase 1. That could be renewed for another 6 months if the two sides agree. To conclude, Rosen cites a Western official as saying, "We are saying consider what is useful to resolve this crisis or not. The pressure from sanctions has been useful to bring Iran into serious negotiations, but timing is of the essence. What matters is not spoiling the opportunity we have here." Now let's take a look at the top headlines from international papers. UAE's Gulf News leads with the headline, "NSA tracks world's 5 billion mobile phones daily." Russia's Moscow Times leads its front page with the headline, "Remnants of doping culture linger." The International New York Times leads its front page, "Investors and swindlers flock to Bitcoin." And finally, China's Global Times leads its front page with the headline, "Beijing moves to ban Bitcoin banking." For more updates and previous analytical press reviews, do visit us on levant.tv. That was all we have time for today. Carl will be with you Monday for another press review.